Part 1. The Wind and Dust of the Frontier. Texas, 1878. The sun was a merciless god, and the town of Redemption was its forgotten altar. It wasn't a town born of hope, but one of necessity, a dusty pause on a long road to somewhere better. The fine red dust, ground to powder by 1,000 wagon wheels and iron-shod hooves, was the town's lifeblood and its curse. It settled in the lines on a man's face, coated the tongues of the thirsty, and rose in devilish plumes with every gust of the unforgiving wind. It muted the colors of the weathered, clapboard buildings, turning the whole world a shade of weary rust. The air hung thick with the smell of cheap whiskey from the saloon. Mingling with the sharper stenches of horse manure and unwashed bodies, life in Redemption was a raw, unfiltered thing. It was in the hard, assessing eyes of the men who lounged on the saloon porch, their gazes lingering on any stranger with a predatory stillness. It was in the weary, guarded expressions of the women who scurried along the boardwalk, their calico dresses limp with dust and sweat. This was a place where survival was a currency, and trust was a fool's luxury. Into this crucible of dust and suspicion walked Evelyn Hayes. She was a ghost from another world, a specter of Eastern propriety lost in the brutal glare of the West. Her dress, once a respectable navy blue, was now faded and stained, the hem frayed from nights spent sleeping in arroyos and thickets. Her hands, once accustomed to the delicate touch of teacups and piano keys, were raw and blistered. But it was her eyes that truly betrayed her. They were the color of a stormy sea, wide with a fear she fought desperately to conceal, yet sharpened by a fierce, hunted intelligence. Every step she took on the creaking boardwalk felt like a judgment. She could feel the stares, feel them dissecting her worn but fine-spun clothes, the desperate clutch of her hand on the small leather satchel that held everything she had left, the weary slump of her shoulders. She was prey, and she knew it. Every man she passed was a potential threat, every shadow a hiding place for the life she had fled. That life was a gilded cage presided over by a man named Silas Croft, a man of immense wealth from the coal mines of Pennsylvania, with cold, possessive eyes and hands that felt like iron clamps. He was to be her husband, an arrangement, her father had called it, a salvation for their family's failing fortunes. For Evelyn, it was a death sentence. Croft hadn't looked at her with love, or even desire, but with the appraising glint of a man acquiring a new, beautiful piece of property. He had wanted to own her spirit, to break it and display it like a prized mare. So, she had run, with a handful of coins and a secret she guarded more closely than her own life. She had boarded a train heading west, chasing a desperate, half-formed dream of freedom. The dream felt very far away now. The men Croft had sent were not phantoms of her imagination. They were real, relentless, and they were getting closer. She had seen them 2 towns back, a pair of hired guns with cruel mouths and dead eyes. She had slipped away then, but her luck was running thin. Her money was nearly gone, and her strength was failing. Here, in Redemption, she needed to buy flour and salted pork, enough to last her until she could get further into the wilderness, further away from the reach of men like Silas Croft. She pushed open the door to the general store, a bell announcing her arrival with a discordant jangle. The store's interior was a dim, cluttered cavern, smelling of coffee beans, leather, and dried tobacco. The storekeeper, a paunchy man with a stained apron, gave her a cursory glance and went back to polishing a rifle. Evelyn kept her head down, her voice barely a whisper as she requested her meager supplies. As the storekeeper weighed the flour, the door jangled again. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, snaked up her spine. She didn't have to turn around. She could feel their presence, the shift in the atmosphere, the sudden weight of menace. Well, look what we got here. Jeb, a gravelly voice drawled, thick with satisfaction, like a lost little canary. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She froze, her hand hovering over the worn coins on the counter. Slowly, she turned. They were the same two men. The taller one, Cletus, had a long, greasy scar that pulled one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. The shorter, stockier one, Jeb, had small, piggish eyes that roamed over her with a filthy familiarity. "The lady's conducting business," the storekeeper grunted, not looking up from his rifle. "He wanted no part of this." "Her business is with us," Cletus said, taking a step forward. He held up a piece of paper. "Got a contract here from a Mr. Silas Croft. Says this little lady belongs to him. Big reward for her safe return." He grinned, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. "Says a safe." But he didn't say she had to be happy. Evelyn backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her eyes darted around the store, searching for an escape. There was none, only a back door, likely bolted. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're mistaken. I don't know any Mr. Croft." Jeb laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She's a feisty one. I like that." He moved to flank her, cutting off her path to the front door. "We ain't mistaken, missy. Now, you can come with us nice and easy, or we can make a scene. Your choice." The world narrowed to the grimy faces of her pursuers, the smell of their sweat and stale liquor. This was it, the end of her desperate flight. The freedom she had bled for was about to be extinguished in a dusty general store in a town that didn't care. She braced herself, a defiant spark igniting in her terrified eyes. She would not go back to Croft. She would rather die here, on this dusty floor. Just as Jeb reached for her arm, the bell on the door sounded a third time, sharp and clear. This time, the presence that entered was different. It wasn't a predator. It was something else entirely. It was power. The man who stood in the doorway was tall, built with the solid, lean strength of a man who lived his life in the saddle. He wasn't handsome in the polished, Eastern way Evelyn was used to. His face was weathered by sun and wind, his jaw square and unyielding. A thick, dark mustache framed a mouth that was set in a firm, neutral line. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a startling, intelligent blue, the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. Evelyn, pale and cornered. The two bounty hunters, poised to strike. The storekeeper, suddenly very interested in the floorboards. He wore his wealth not in flashy jewels, but in the quiet quality of his gear. His boots were worn but made of the finest leather. The gun belt that sat low on his hips was expertly tooled. The handle of the Colt Peacemaker nestled in its holster smooth and dark with use. He carried an aura of absolute competence, a dangerous stillness that commanded the space around him. The low chatter from the saloon across the street seemed to die down, as if the whole town held its breath. This was Jack Callahan. His name was a legend in this part of Texas. Owner of the sprawling C-Bar Ranch, a man known to be as generous to his friends as he was ruthless to his enemies. He was a man who had carved an empire out of the wilderness with his own two hands, a man who answered to no one. He walked further into the store, his spurs making a soft, metallic whisper on the wooden floor. He ignored the two men and addressed the storekeeper. "Silas, I need a sack of feed corn and 2 spools of your best wire." His voice was a low baritone, calm and steady, as if he hadn't just walked into a kidnapping. Cletus, emboldened by his contract and the promise of a reward, stepped forward. "This ain't your concern. Callahan, we're on official business." Jack Callahan finally turned his winter blue eyes on the two men. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. It was somehow more terrifying. "Is that so?" he said, his voice deceptively mild. "Because it looks to me like you're scaring the customers." He gave a slight nod toward Evelyn. "And the lady seems to find your official businesses disagreeable." "She's a runaway," Jeb sneered. "Belongs to our employer. We're just collecting property." The word property hung in the air, foul and heavy. Something flickered in Jack's eyes, a brief, cold fire. He took another slow step forward. So he was standing between them and Evelyn. He was taller than both men, his presence a physical barrier. "I've found that most things in this world that are worth a damn don't like being called property," Jack said, his voice dropping an octave. "Now, I'm going to ask you boys one time. Apologize to the lady and ride out of this town. Don't come back." It was a dismissal, not a negotiation, a declaration from a king in his own kingdom. Cletus's hand twitched toward his gun. It was a fatal miscalculation. He had mistaken Jack's calm for weakness. The motion was a blur. Jack's hand didn't seem to move faster than thought, but it was impossibly swift, impossibly precise. It wasn't his gun he drew. His left hand shot out and clamped around Cletus's wrist, his grip like a vice. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and Cletus screamed, a high, thin sound of agony as his pistol clattered to the floor. Before Jeb could even process what had happened, Jack had already turned, his right fist connecting with Jeb's jaw in a short, brutal arc. The punch was economical and devastating. Jeb's head snapped back, his eyes rolled up, and he crumpled to the floor in a boneless heap, unconscious before he landed. Jack released Cletus, who cradled his shattered wrist, his face a mask of white-hot pain and disbelief. "I believe I told you to leave," Jack said, his voice still unnervingly calm. He nudged Cletus's fallen gun with the toe of his boot, sending it spinning into a dark corner, sobbing with pain. Cletus scrambled backward, kicking his unconscious partner in a desperate attempt to rouse him before dragging him out the door and into the dusty street. The bell jangled mockingly on their retreat. The silence that fell in the store was absolute, broken only by Evelyn's shaky breaths. She stared at Jack Callahan, her rescuer. He hadn't done it with heroic flair or a self-righteous speech. He had dealt with the threat with the cold, detached efficiency of a man swatting a fly. It was terrifying and, in a way she couldn't yet understand, deeply reassuring. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. His gaze wasn't predatory like the others, but it was just as intense, as if he were looking right through her, weighing and measuring her soul. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He looked at the supplies on the counter, then back at her. "You're a long way from home." It wasn't a question. I'm not," she began, her voice failing her. She didn't know what to say. He had saved her, but who was he? What did he want in her world? Men like this, men with such power, always wanted something. "You don't have to tell me," he said, seeming to read her mind. He pulled a few coins from his pocket and tossed them on the counter. More than enough to cover her supplies and his own. Silas put her things in a sack, and the feed corn. The storekeeper, finally seeming to come back to life, hurried to obey. Jack looked back at Evelyn. The hardness in his eyes had softened, just a fraction, replaced by a flicker of something she couldn't name. Pity, no. It was more like recognition, a weariness that mirrored her own. "Those men, or men like them, they won't stop," he said, his voice low. "A man like Silas Croft doesn't give up on his property." He said the word with a quiet, bitter contempt. "You won't last a week out there on your own." Her chin lifted, the defiant spark returning to her eyes. "I have to." He held her gaze for a long moment. He saw the terror, but he also saw the steel beneath it. He saw the spirit that Croft had tried to break. "My ranch is a half-day's ride north of here," he said, the offer hanging in the air between them, simple and unadorned. "You'd be safe there. They wouldn't dare follow you," he added, before she could protest. "I've got work. You can earn your keep. No one gets a free ride at the Sea Bar, not even a lady in trouble." He was offering her a sanctuary, but on his terms, it was a choice. Perhaps the first real choice she'd had since leaving Pennsylvania. Trust this dangerous, quiet man, or face the wilderness and the bounty hunters alone. The wind howled outside, kicking up another wave of red dust that rattled against the window panes. It was the sound of the frontier, wild, lonely, and unforgiving. Looking into the depths of Jack Callahan's winter sky eyes, Evelyn Hayes had a feeling that he was the frontier made flesh, and for the first time in a long time, the prospect of facing it didn't feel like a death sentence. It felt terrifyingly like a chance to finally live. Part 2: The Wounded Man. The ride from Redemption to the C-Bar Ranch was a lesson in silence and scale. Jack Callahan set a steady pace, his powerful stallion eating up the miles with an easy, ground-covering gait. He had procured a gentle mare for Evelyn from the livery, and she rode beside him, the silence between them as vast and unyielding as the Texas plains that stretched out in every direction. The world was an immense canvas of pale grass and endless sky, the sun a white-hot coin overhead. Evelyn watched him, studying the man who had so violently and efficiently inserted himself into her life. He rode with a natural, fluid grace, a man perfectly at one with his horse and his environment. He seemed a part of the landscape itself, hard, enduring, and shaped by forces she could only begin to imagine. He rarely spoke, offering only a gruff word to point out a landmark or warn of a prairie dog hole. His silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts and guarded memories. Evelyn, accustomed to the constant, mannered chatter of the East, found it both unnerving and oddly comforting. It was an honest silence, demanding nothing from her. As the afternoon wore on, the land began to change. The open plains gave way to rolling hills dotted with live oaks and, in the distance, the hazy blue line of a low mountain range. They began to see cattle, hundreds of them, fat and healthy, bearing a brand of a C nested over a simple bar. The sheer number of them was staggering. This was his kingdom, not a town built of dust and desperation, but a living, breathing empire of grass and beef. The wealth he possessed wasn't in a vault, it was in the land itself, stretching further than her eye could see. The ranch headquarters appeared first as a dark smudge on the horizon, slowly resolving itself into a collection of sturdy, well-kept buildings. The main house was not the rough-hewn log cabin she might have expected. It was a long, low structure built of thick, dark timber and solid river stone, with a wide porch that ran its entire length. It was a fortress, built to withstand the harshest winds and the most determined of enemies. It was magnificent. Yet, as they drew closer, she felt a profound sense of emptiness emanating from it, a deep and abiding loneliness that the vastness of the land only seemed to amplify. A handful of ranch hands, tough men with sun-creased faces, stopped their work to watch them approach. Their expressions were curious but respectful. They nodded to their boss, their eyes flicking briefly to Evelyn, taking her measure before returning to their tasks. A stout, gray-haired woman with warm, dark eyes and a face like a friendly road map came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. "Mr. Jack," she said, her voice laced with a soft Spanish accent. "You are back." Her gaze fell on Evelyn, and a flicker of surprise and concern crossed her features. "Maria, this is Miss Hayes," Jack said, swinging down from his horse with weary grace. "She'll be staying with us for a while. She'll be helping you out. Find her a room." The introduction was blunt, practical. He offered Evelyn a hand down, his grip firm and impersonal. For a moment, her fingers were engulfed in his, and she felt the calloused strength there, the raw power held in careful check. Then he released her and turned to one of the hands. "See to the horses. Ben, rub them down well." With that, he was gone, striding toward the massive barn without a backward glance, already consumed by the work that was his only true companion. Maria's smile was kind. "Come, child. You look like you have been through a great fire. Let's get you inside." The house was as solid and imposing on the inside as it was on the out. The main room was dominated by a cavernous stone fireplace, big enough to roast a whole steer. The furniture was heavy, made of dark, polished wood and good leather, built to last 100 years, but it was all achingly empty. There were no portraits on the walls, no delicate trifles on the mantelpiece, none of the small, personal touches that transform a house into a home. It was clean, meticulously cared for by Maria, but it felt like a museum of a life, not a place where one was lived. It was the house of a rich man who had nothing left to put in it. Over the next few days, Evelyn learned the rhythms of Jack Callahan's life. He was a man possessed by work. He rose before the sun and returned after dusk, his body tired but his mind seemingly no quieter. He drove himself and his men with a relentless energy, as if he believed that if he stopped moving, his personal demons would finally catch him. He ate his meals with her and Maria in the large kitchen, but he was a silent presence at the table, his thoughts clearly 1,000 miles away, lost in some desolate landscape of his own making. Evelyn, true to his word, worked for her keep. She helped Maria with the cooking and cleaning, mended clothes with stitches far finer than any the ranch hands had ever seen, and started a small vegetable garden in a patch of earth behind the kitchen. The simple, physical labor was a balm to her frayed nerves. It grounded her, gave her a sense of purpose beyond simply running. And as she worked, she watched him. She saw him in the evenings, sitting alone on the porch, staring out at the vast, darkening expanse of his land, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. She saw the way his men respected him, but also the way they kept their distance, sensing the invisible wall he had built around himself. He was their provider, their commander, but not their friend. He was utterly, profoundly alone. He fought against her presence in his own quiet way. He avoided being alone with her. His conversations limited to curt, necessary questions about her well-being or the tasks she was performing. Yet, he couldn't seem to help himself. His eyes would find her across the yard. He would pause for a moment while shoeing a horse to watch her hang laundry, the white sheets brilliant against the endless blue sky. Evelyn could feel his gaze on her, a conflicted, unwilling magnetism. She saw in his eyes a flicker of something that had long been dormant, a spark of life, of awareness, and it seemed to frighten him more than any outlaw's gun. He didn't want to feel. He didn't want to be reminded of what it was to share a space, a life, with a woman. One evening, the heat held on long after the sun had bled below the horizon. The air was still and heavy. Jack had been working late, wrestling a stubborn calf from a mud-bogged creek bed. He came to the water pump near the side of the house, his clothes and skin caked with mud and sweat. He shucked off his shirt, tossing it onto a railing. Evelyn was on the porch, ostensibly mending a tear in one of her sleeves, but really just soaking in the quiet of the evening. She saw him in the moonlight, his back to her as he worked the pump handle. His body was a testament to his lithe, broad shoulders, a narrow waist. His arms and back a landscape of corded muscle that moved with lean efficiency under his sun-darkened skin. He was powerful, elemental, a creature of this wild land. As he turned to splash the cold water over his face and chest, she saw it, a thick, puckered scar that started near his collarbone and slashed diagonally across his chest, disappearing over the hard muscle of his left pectoral. It was a vicious, ugly thing, a mark of brutal violence that had come perilously close to his heart. It was an old wound, long since healed, but its presence spoke of a pain that was anything but. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a gasp of shock or pity, but of sudden, stark understanding. That was the source of the emptiness in his eyes. That was the ghost that haunted the halls of this house. He wasn't just a man who had chosen solitude. He was a man who had had it violently thrust upon him. He must have felt her gaze. He straightened up, the water dripping from his hair and mustache, and his eyes met hers across the yard. For a heartbeat, his face was unguarded, and she saw a raw, unvarnished agony there. a vulnerability so profound it made her own troubles feel small. Then the mask slammed back into place. His jaw tightened, and his expression became one of cold fury. He snatched his shirt from the railing, turning his back to her as he pulled it on, hiding the scar from her sight. The moment was broken, the brief connection severed. He walked away without a word, disappearing into the shadows of the barn. The incident created a new, unspoken tension between them. A week later, it came to a head. He found her by the corral after the evening meal, watching the young foals chase each other in the twilight. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat. He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains, now purple silhouettes against the dying light. Evelyn turned to face him, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. "All right. I took a risk bringing you here. Miss Hayes," he began, his tone formal. "My men, this ranch, they're my responsibility. I put them at risk for a stranger. I need to know what I'm up against. The whole truth." He finally looked at her, and his blue eyes were piercing. A man like Silas Croft doesn't hire guns and send them halfway across the country just for a runaway fiancé. "There's more to it. What are you not telling me?" The directness of the question stole her breath. She had been living under his protection, eating his food, sleeping in his house, all while holding back the most important part of her story. She had been afraid, terrified that the truth would make her a liability he couldn't afford, that he would cast her out. But looking at him now, at the hard-won integrity in his face, she knew he deserved the truth. And more than that, she realized with a jolt that she wanted to give it to him. She wanted, for the first time, to trust someone with her secret. "You're right," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "It's not just about me." She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the small leather satchel she never let out of her sight. Her hands trembled slightly as she untied the leather thong. From inside, she carefully extracted a folded piece of oiled canvas. She held it out to him. "My father was a geologist," she explained, her voice gaining strength. "He prospected all over the West. He was brilliant, but never had much luck. Before he died, he found it, a place in the Sierra Madre Mountains, a vein of gold so rich, he said it would make a man a king." Jack took the offered canvas, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as he unfolded it. In the fading light, he saw a meticulously hand-drawn map, covered in geological notations and landmarks, a twisted pine, a bear-shaped rock formation, a specific bend in a river. "Croft was my father's business partner," Evelyn continued, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. "He cheated my father, ruined him. My father died a broken man, but not before he gave this to me. It was all he had left to leave me. My inheritance. My one chance at a life of my own. A life where I wouldn't need a husband or a father to provide for me. Croft knows it exists. He doesn't know where the mine is, but he suspects I have the map. Marrying me was the easiest way to get his hands on it. When I ran, I didn't just steal myself from him. I stole his treasure." Jack stared at the map, his face grim. The lines and symbols on the page represented a fortune. But he saw something else. He saw death. He saw greed powerful enough to burn the world down. He saw the kind of fight that attracts the worst kind of men like the ones who had left that scar on his chest. Men like the ones who had taken his wife, Isabella, from him during a raid just like the one this map would surely invite. He looked up from the map, his eyes finding hers in the deepening twilight. The conflict within him was a silent, raging storm. The woman before him was not just a damsel in distress. She was the keeper of a key that could unlock hell itself and bring it straight to his front door. Every instinct for self-preservation, every scar on his body and soul, screamed at him to send her away, to get this danger as far from his home as possible. But as he looked at her, at the mix of fear and defiance in her stormy eyes, at the courage that had brought her this far, he felt that long-dormant part of him stir once more. It was the feeling of being alive, of being engaged in a fight that mattered. To turn her away now would be to surrender to the ghosts of his past. It would be an admission that his life was over, that all he had left was to manage his own slow decline into lonely old age. He slowly, carefully folded the map and handed it back to her. "You've brought a whole world of trouble to my doorstep, Evelyn Hayes," he said, his voice a low rumble. For the first time, he had used her given name. It hung in the air between them, a fragile and unexpected bridge. The wounded man had made a choice. He would not run from this fight. He would face it, right alongside her. Part 3, Fire and Desire. The confession of the map settled the dust between them. In the weeks that followed, a fragile trust began to sprout in the barren soil of their shared solitude. The heavy silence that had once defined their interactions softened, making room for quiet conversations over the dinner table and shared glances across the bustling ranch yard. Jack, having accepted the burden of her secret, seemed to accept her presence in a more fundamental way. He was no longer just her protector. He was, however reluctantly, her partner in this dangerous waiting game. He began to teach her the language of his world. He showed her how to read the clouds as they gathered over the distant peaks, predicting the rare but violent thunderstorms. He pointed out the difference between the track of a wolf and that of a coyote. One afternoon, he took her to the corrals and, with a patience that surprised her, taught her to properly saddle the gentle mare she rode, his large, calloused hands guiding hers over the leather straps, sending a jolt of unexpected warmth through her. In these moments, the walls around him would crumble, just a little, and she would see the man beneath the legend, a man with a deep, abiding love for the land and the creatures that roamed it. Evelyn, in turn, began to fill the empty spaces of his home. It started with small things, a jar of wildflowers on the heavy oak dining table, the scent of freshly baked bread, a smell that hadn't graced the house in years, that made even the grizzled ranch hands smile. She repaired the worn curtains in the main room, her nimble fingers a quiet testament to a life left behind. These were not the calculated actions of a woman trying to earn her keep. They were the unconscious instincts of a spirit putting down roots, transforming a sterile shelter into a place of comfort. The Seabar Ranch was a world unto itself, a kingdom of breathtaking, savage beauty. Every evening, Evelyn would watch the sun set, a spectacle of such violent and glorious color it made her ache. The sky would bleed crimson and gold, setting the vast dry grasslands ablaze with a fiery light. It was during these moments she would often see the ranch's herd of brood mares, 100 strong, thundering across the plains, their manes and tails streaming behind them like banners of smoke against the dying sun. They were the embodiment of the West Wild, powerful and untamably free. Watching them, she felt a kinship, a reflection of the very freedom she was fighting for. This fragile peace, however, was confined to the boundaries of the Callahan Ranch. The world beyond its fences had not forgotten them, and after a month, supplies ran low. A trip to Redemption was unavoidable. "You should stay here," Jack said, his tone flat, betraying the concern beneath it. "Maria can give you a list." "And what happens when Croft's men come sniffing around town again, asking questions?" Evelyn countered, her chin set with a familiar stubbornness. "They'll hear about a woman hiding out at the Seabar. It's better if they see me, if we act as if there's nothing to hide." He knew she was right. Hiding was an admission of guilt, of fear. He looked at her, seeing not the terrified refugee he'd rescued, but a woman whose courage was hardening into something as resilient as prairie steel. He gave a single, sharp nod. "All right, be ready at sunrise." Redemption was just as dusty and judgmental as she remembered. As they rode down the main street, a palpable silence fell. Windows twitched with unseen watchers. The men lounging on the saloon porch stopped their whittling and spat into the dust, their eyes following Evelyn with a mixture of crude curiosity and suspicion. She was Jack Callahan's woman. The speculation was a tangible thing, a greasy film in the air. The chill was most pronounced in the general store. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife and the town's self-appointed moral compass, pursed her lips into a thin, disapproving line the moment they entered. She served Jack with a frosty civility, but pointedly ignored Evelyn, answering her polite questions with monosyllabic grunts directed at her husband. As they were about to leave, their arms laden with supplies, a local rancher's wife, a woman named Martha, entered the store. She saw them and stopped, her eyes widening. "Well, Jack Callahan," she said, her voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. "I see the rumors are true. Heard you'd picked up some fancy new stock." She let the word hang in the air, weighted with insinuation. Evelyn felt the blood rush to her cheeks, the insult a physical blow. She saw the sneers on the faces of the other customers. To them, she wasn't a person, she was a scandal, a mysterious woman of questionable virtue, living under the roof of the area's most powerful and reclusive bachelor. Before Evelyn could even think of a response, Jack moved. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply set his sack of flour down on the counter with a soft, deliberate thud, and turned his winter blue eyes on Martha. The temperature in the store seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Martha," he said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper, "Miss Hayes is a guest under my protection. If I ever hear you, or anyone else in this town, speak to her with anything less than the respect she is due. I'll take it as a personal offense." He paused, letting the threat settle. "And you all know how I handle personal offenses. My business, and the business of the C-Bar, can easily be taken elsewhere." The threat was clear. The C-Bar was the lifeblood of redemption. Without Callahan's business, the town would wither and die. Martha paled, stammering a hasty, insincere apology. The other customers suddenly found the contents of the pickle barrel intensely fascinating. Jack held the silence for a beat longer, his cold gaze sweeping over every person in the store, branding them with his warning. Then, he picked up his flour sack, took Evelyn's arm, and guided her out into the blinding sunlight. The ride back to the ranch was tense. The beauty of the landscape seemed to mock the ugliness they had left behind. Evelyn felt a fresh wave of despair. She had not only brought danger to his door, but shame as well. "I'm sorry, Jack," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I never meant for my troubles to tarnish your name." He was silent for a long time, his jaw set as he stared straight ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "My name can take care of itself. It was you I was worried about. No one deserves to be looked at like that." He glanced at her, and in his eyes, she saw not pity, but a shared anger, a protective fury that made her feel, for the first time since her escape, truly safe. They were allies. It was them against the world. That evening, the connection forged in the crucible of the town's scorn deepened into something new, something unspoken and powerful. The day had been long and draining, ending with the difficult task of separating a sick calf from its frantic mother. Jack had worked with a focused intensity, his strength and gentleness in equal measure as he handled the animals. Now, as twilight painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose, Evelyn saw him by the horse trough. The air was warm and still, and he had stripped off his sweat-soaked shirt to wash away the grime of the day. It was the second time she had seen him so exposed, but this time was different. She didn't stumble upon him by accident. She stood in the deep shadows of the porch, drawn by a force she no longer tried to fight, and simply watched. The setting sun gilded his skin, highlighting the powerful muscles of his back and shoulders as he sluiced water over himself. He was so large, so overwhelmingly male. The sheer physical presence of him was a thing of wonder. Every line of his body spoke of hard work and resilience. He was a man carved from the very rock and soil of this land. Her eyes traced the jagged path of the scar across his chest. Before, she had seen it as a symbol of his pain, a key to his past. Now, she saw it as part of him, a testament to his survival. A strange, fierce tenderness swelled in her chest, a desire to soothe the wound that she knew ran far deeper than the flesh. He was magnificent. The thought came to her, unbidden and absolute. It wasn't the refined handsomeness of the men she had known in the East. This was something far more potent. It was the raw, undeniable beauty of strength, of competence, of a man who was wholly and unapologetically himself. A blush crept up her neck, hot and insistent, but it was not a blush of maidenly embarrassment. It was the flush of a deeper, more profound heat, a slow burning fire that had been kindled deep within her. It was the startling, terrifying, and exhilarating awakening of her own desire. She watched as he finished, running a hand through his wet, dark hair, his broad chest rising and falling with his steady breaths. He was completely unaware of her presence, alone in his world, and the intimacy of the stolen moment was breathtaking. This was Jack Callahan, not the legend, not the wealthy rancher, not her protector, just a man, a wounded, solitary, beautiful man. And she, Evelyn Hayes, the runaway from the East, wanted him with a depth and intensity that shook her to her very soul. The fire in the sky had found its echo, and it was now burning inside of her. Part 4, "You're so big," she murmured. The confession of the town's scorn had forged a new and volatile element between them. In the days that followed, the air in the ranch house grew thick with unspoken things. A simple passing in the hallway became a moment of heightened awareness. The brush of his hand against hers as he passed her a water dipper sent a current through her that was as powerful as a lightning strike. He had claimed her as his own in the eyes of the world, and in doing so, had irrevocably altered the space between them. The vastness of the house, which had once seemed to swallow them in its loneliness, now felt charged and intimate, every corner humming with a silent, simmering tension. This tension found its echo in the sky. For 3 days, a oppressive stillness settled over the plains. The sun was a hazy, sullen eye behind a veil of high, thin clouds. The air grew heavy, humid, and smelled of dust and distant rain. The cattle were restless in the pastures, and the horses in the corral were skittish, their ears twitching at the charged silence. A storm was coming. Not a brief, violent thunderstorm that washed the world clean, but a slow, brooding tempest that gathered its strength with menacing patience. On the third evening, it broke. The sky, which had been a bruised purplish gray all afternoon, finally turned black. The wind began to moan, a low, mournful sound that rose to a piercing shriek, rattling the window panes in their frames and driving sheets of hard, cold rain against the solid timber walls. Maria, after securing the shutters and murmuring a prayer, retired to her room. The ranch hands were hunkered down in the bunkhouse, the glow of their lamps a tiny, defiant pinprick in the roaring dark. Jack and Evelyn were alone in the main room. A fire roared in the great stone hearth, casting a warm, dancing light that pushed back against the storm's fury, creating a small, golden island of sanctuary in the heart of the maelstrom. The sound of the wind and rain was a constant, elemental roar, isolating them completely from the rest of the world. All of civilization seemed to have been stripped away, leaving only the two of them and the storm. Jack sat in his worn leather armchair, methodically cleaning his Colt Peacemaker, the metallic clicks of the action a small, precise sound against the chaos outside. Evelyn sat opposite, a book open in her lap. Though she hadn't turned a page in an hour, her eyes kept straying to him, to the way the firelight carved his face into stark planes and shadows, to the focused calm of his powerful hands as they worked. The simmering tension of the past week had come to a boil in the crucible of the storm. The air between them was electric, vibrating with everything they had never said. "You're not afraid of storms, are you?" Jack asked, his voice a low rumble that was nearly swallowed by a sudden, deafening clap of thunder. He didn't look up from his work. "No," she answered, her own voice surprisingly steady. "My father used to say a storm was just the sky clearing its throat. It's the silence that comes after that you have to worry about." He paused, a clean patch of oilcloth in his hand, and finally looked at her. Her words seemed to strike a chord deep within him. He was a wise man. "He was a dreamer," she corrected softly. "His dreams were just bigger than his luck." "There's worse things to be," Jack said, his gaze distant. Lost for a moment in the flames, he was thinking of his own dreams, the ones that had turned to ash right here in this very house. The dream of a life filled with laughter, with the warmth of a wife and the promise of children. A dream that had died with Isabella. He had spent 5 years trying to bury that dream, to convince himself that a man was better off without them. But the woman sitting across from him, with her stormy eyes and quiet courage, was making him remember what it felt like to hope. He set the gun aside. The work finished. The room fell silent, save for the fire and the storm. He rose and walked to the fireplace, resting one arm on the heavy stone mantel, staring down into the flames. His broad back was to her, a wall of muscle and solitude. Evelyn felt an irresistible pull, a need to close the distance between them that was stronger than her fear, stronger than her propriety. She put her book aside and rose, her footsteps silent on the thick bearskin rug. She came to a stop just behind him, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the faint, clean scent of rain, leather, and wood smoke that clung to him. "Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't turn, but she saw his shoulders tense. He was a man braced for a blow. She reached out, her hand trembling, and laid her palm flat against the center of his back, against the warm, solid strength of him. Through the fabric of his shirt, she could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart. It was the most terrifying, most exhilarating thing she had ever done. He flinched at her touch, a sharp, involuntary movement, as if he'd been burned, but he didn't pull away. He stood rigid, a statue of conflicted stillness. "This is a mistake, Evelyn," he said, his voice ragged, strained. "Is it?" she asked, her own voice trembling with a terrifying new boldness. "Or is it the first right thing that's happened to either of us in a long, long time?" Slowly, he turned to face her. The firelight bathed them, catching the raw torment in his eyes. She saw it all there, the grief, the fear, the years of iron-willed loneliness, and beneath it all, a deep, aching hunger that mirrored her own. His gaze dropped to her hand, which was still pressed against his chest. Her fingers instinctively traced the line of his shirt, feeling the hard muscle beneath. She was thinking of the scar that lay hidden there, of the violent pain that had marked him so deeply. She thought of the breadth of his shoulders, the sheer solidness of him that made her feel so safe. She thought of the size of his ranch, his life, the vast emptiness he lived in, and the even vaster space he had made for her within it. Her world had been so small, so suffocating, and he was as immense and untamed as the land itself. The awe of it all, the overwhelming reality of him, escaped her in a breathy, wondering whisper. "You're so big," she murmured. The words were a catalyst, breaking the last of his restraint. His face, a mask of torment a moment before, was suddenly consumed by a fierce, wild blaze. He groaned, a low, guttural sound of surrender, and his hands came up to frame her face, his calloused thumbs stroking her cheekbones as if to be certain she was real. "Evelyn," he breathed, and then his mouth was on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and starvation, of a man dying of thirst who had just found a spring. It was fierce, possessive, a release of 5 years of pent-up grief and loneliness. He kissed her with a wild desire that bordered on anguish, his mouth claiming hers, tasting her, learning her. There was no artifice, no gentle exploration. It was a raw, elemental collision, as wild and untamed as the storm that raged outside. Evelyn met his ferocity with her own. All her fear, all her uncertainty, melted away in the searing heat of his embrace. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, answering the desperate hunger in his kiss with a burgeoning passion she never knew she possessed. This was what she had been running toward, not just away from, this feeling of being utterly known, utterly wanted. This was freedom. When he finally broke the kiss, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. His eyes, when they opened, were a brilliant, stormy blue. Stripped of all their defenses, she saw the man he was, naked and vulnerable before her. He lowered his hands from her face, his gaze never leaving hers, and took her hand, pressing her palm flat against his chest, directly over his heart, over the hidden scar. "All of me is yours," he said, his voice thick with an emotion so profound it was almost a vow. "The ranch, the name," his voice broke, just for a second. "The ghosts, all of it, it's all yours." It was not just a declaration of love. It was a transference of his soul. He was giving her the keys to his wounded kingdom, trusting her with the broken pieces of his life. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes as she felt his heart hammering against her palm. A frantic, powerful rhythm. This was the moment their two lonely souls touched, finding not a cure for their old wounds, but a shared strength to bear them together. The fury of the storm began to recede, its rage spent. The thunder softened to a distant rumble, and the wind's shriek died down to a low whisper. In the quiet that followed, they stood by the fire, wrapped in a new and profound intimacy. The world outside held at bay. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the world washed clean by the storm. A fragile, hopeful light filled the ranch house. Jack and Evelyn met in the kitchen, the air between them still charged, but with a new, tender warmth, a shy smile, a lingering touch, the silent language of a love just born. But the storm had washed away more than just the dust. As Jack stepped onto the porch, a mug of coffee in his hand, his eyes scanned the horizon, a lifelong habit, and then he froze. High on the western ridge, miles away but perfectly clear in the crisp morning air, was the silhouette of a lone rider on a horse. The figure was utterly still, a dark sentinel watching the ranch house. He was too far away to make out any details, but his intent was unmistakable. They were being watched. Evelyn came to stand beside him. Following his gaze, she saw the rider and her blood ran cold. The brief, beautiful peace of their new world was shattered. "Croft," she whispered. Jack didn't answer. He just put his arm around her, pulling her close against his side. The tenderness of the gesture was now alloyed with a grim, protective strength. Their love had been kindled in a storm, a defiant flame against the darkness. Now, the darkness was pushing back. The enemy had found them. Their fight had just begun. Part V, The Gathering Shadows. The pristine beauty of the morning was a lie. The lone rider on the ridge was a harbinger, a dark promise of the violence to come. The tender, nascent world Jack and Evelyn had built for themselves in the heart of the storm was now under siege. The hope that had dawned with the clear sky was instantly tarnished by the cold iron of reality. Silas Croft had found them. Jack's reaction was immediate and grim. The lover who had held her by the fire vanished, replaced by the commander of the C-Bar. His orders were issued with quiet, steely authority. Riders were dispatched to the far-flung corners of the ranch, instructed to pull back, to consolidate the herds and the men. Sentries were posted on the high ground, their task no longer to watch for wolves among the cattle, but for the two-legged kind. The ranch house, once a lonely sanctuary, began to feel like a fortress preparing for a siege. Every man on the C-Bar knew Jack Callahan. knew the tragedy that had shaped him, and they moved with a grim efficiency. They knew this was not a fight over land or cattle. This was a fight against the ghosts of the past. Meanwhile, the source of their dread made its presence known in Redemption. They did not ride into town like common drifters. They arrived like a conquering army, a dozen riders led by a man who moved with the chilling poise of a coiled snake. His name was Cole Rourke, a man whose reputation was whispered in fearful tones from the Rio Grande to the Canadian border. He was not a common outlaw who robbed stages. He was a tactician, a former Confederate officer who now sold his martial skills to the highest bidder. His men were not drunken thugs. They were hard, disciplined veterans who had learned their trade in the crucible of war. Silas Croft had not hired bounty hunters this time. He had hired a private army. Rourke established his headquarters in the saloon, but there was no rowdy carousing. He and his men were quiet, watchful, their presence sucking the air out of the room. Rourke didn't make threats. He made propositions. He laid Croft's money on the bar, buying rounds for the entire town, his voice a smooth, reasonable baritone as he spun his tale. He spoke of a wealthy, respectable businessman from the East, a Mr. Croft, who had been wronged. His fiancée, a flighty and unstable young woman, had been taken in by the reclusive and powerful Jack Callahan. All Mr. Croft wanted was the return of what was rightfully his. He offered gold not just for information, but for cooperation. For a blind eye turned here, a convenient bit of forgetfulness there. To the sheriff, he offered a donation to the town's coffers that was 10 times the lawman's yearly salary. To the livery owner, he paid a month's earnings just to stable his horses. To the gossips and the greedy, he offered a simple, seductive bargain: Jack Callahan's loyalty, or Silas Croft's gold for a town built on desperation. It was hardly a choice at all. The poison spread quickly. The whispers that had once been about Evelyn's virtue now shifted to Jack's supposed villainy. The townspeople who had known him for years, who had benefited from his generosity in hard winters, now looked away when his supply wagon came to town. The storekeeper, whose business Callahan had saved from bankruptcy twice, suddenly had trouble remembering if he'd seen any strangers about. Redemption, swayed by fear and avarice, had chosen its side. The sea bar was now an island, completely surrounded by a hostile sea. The news, brought back by a grim-faced Ben, settled like a shroud over the ranch. For Jack, it was a waking nightmare, a horrifying echo of the past. The weight of his decision to protect Evelyn became a physical burden, pressing down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. He grew distant, the warmth of the previous night sealed away behind a wall of cold, hard duty. He found himself in the barn late one night, long after the others were asleep. The familiar smell of hay and horseflesh usually calmed him, but tonight it offered no comfort. He ran a hand over the smooth, worn wood of a stall door, and the memories he had fought to keep buried for 5 long years broke free. He was there again. The night was moonless, the air thick with the smell of smoke. The raid had come without warning, a swarm of faceless demons out of the dark. He remembered the screams of men and horses, the flash of gunfire that illuminated scenes of pure horror. He remembered fighting with a savage desperation, not for land or cattle, but for the woman in the house. He remembered breaking free, racing back to the main room, his heart a cold knot of dread. He remembered the sight of Isabella, her dark hair fanned out on the floor, her eyes wide with a surprise that would never fade, a small, dark stain spreading across the bodice of her favorite dress. The memory was so vivid he could almost smell the gunpowder, could almost feel the soul-crushing emptiness that had hollowed him out in that moment. He had built this empire, this fortress of a house, to protect her, and it had failed. His wealth, his power, his men, none of it had been enough to save her. Now, it was happening again. He had let another woman into his life, into his home. He had promised her his protection, promised her all that he was, and in doing so, he had painted a target on her back, and on the backs of every man who called the sea bar home, The thought of losing Evelyn, of seeing that same horror play out a second time, was a torment beyond endurance. The conflict tore him apart. His heart, so recently and miraculously reawakened, told him to hold her, to fight for her. But the cold, terrified voice of his past screamed at him to send her away, to save her by letting her go, to push her out of his life so that the darkness closing in would swallow only him. Evelyn felt his withdrawal like a physical chill. The man who had given her his ghosts was now lost among them, and he had locked her out. She found him in the barn, his silhouette a study in lonely anguish against the open doors. "Jack," she said softly, refusing to let him push her away. "Talk to me." "There's nothing to talk about," he said, his voice a dead, flat monotone. He didn't turn to look at her. "I'm making arrangements. Ben will take you north at dawn. There's a train you can catch in Ogallala. I'll give you enough money to get anywhere you want to go. California, Oregon, somewhere Croft will never find you." The words were like stones, each one striking her with a cold, brutal finality. He was sending her away. The logic was sound, sensible, and it felt like the cruelest betrayal. "You're sending me away?" she asked, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a rising anger. "After your promise, after everything." "I'm trying to keep you alive," he finally roared, whirling to face her, his face a mask of agony in the moonlight. "Don't you understand this place? I bring death to the people I care about. It happened before. I will not let it happen again. I won't let him do to you what they did to Isabella." It was the first time he had spoken his late wife's name to her. The sound of it hung in the air, a testament to the depth of his wound. Evelyn closed the distance between them, her own fear eclipsed by a fierce, protective love for this broken man. She stood before him, unflinching, and laid her hands on his chest. "I am not Isabella," she said, her voice clear and strong. "This is not the same. That was a random tragedy. This is a fight we chose. You chose it when you stood up for me in that store. I chose it when I showed you that map, and we both chose it in front of the fire." She looked up into his tormented eyes. "Do you think sending me away will keep you safe? Do you think Rourke and his men will just pack up and leave? They'll tear this place apart, looking for me in the map. And what of you? You'll be right back where you were, alone in this big, empty house with nothing but your ghosts for company. That's not living. Jack, that's a slow death." She took a deep breath. "I will not be the cause of any more pain for you. If you truly want me to go, I will, but I will not run and hide. I will ride back to redemption, and I will turn myself over to Rourke. I will give him the map. I will trade it for the safety of this ranch and the men who live here." He stared at her, horrified. The thought of her in the hands of men like Rourke was a red-hot poker to his soul. Her selfless courage, her refusal to be a victim, shattered the last of his fearful logic. She was right. Sending her away wasn't a solution. It was an abdication. It was letting the ghosts win. He had given her his ghosts, and she was not afraid of them. She was standing with him in the dark, offering to help him fight them. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him, his face buried in her hair. "No," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "No, you're not going anywhere. Forgive me. I was afraid." "I'm afraid, too," she whispered into his chest. "But I'd rather be afraid here, with you, than safe anywhere else in the world without you." He held her tightly, a long, shuddering breath racking his body. In her arms, the choice became clear. Love was not a liability. It was armor. They would face this together. The psychological war began the next day. 100 yards of new fencing was cut during the night, scattering a prize bull and a dozen heifers into the open range. A few days later, a remote line shack used by the ranch hands for shelter during roundups was burned to the ground, the plume of black smoke visible for miles, a deliberate and arrogant message. Rourke was testing them, probing their defenses, stretching their resources thin as Jack's men were forced to ride out to repair the damage and hunt for the scattered livestock. The Seabar, once a sprawling and efficient empire, was being forced to shrink, to pull its resources into a defensive crouch around the main house. The shadows were no longer gathering on the horizon. They were creeping across the fields, their tendrils tightening around the ranch. Then, one evening, as Jack was making his final rounds, he found it, lying on the stone porch, placed squarely in front of the main door, was a single, withered calla lily. It was a small, simple thing, but Jack stopped as if he'd been shot. His blood ran cold, and the air froze in his lungs. Calla lilies had been Isabella's favorite flower. A small, wild patch of them grew near the quiet spot in the family cemetery where she was buried. Rourke had not just sent a message. He had delivered a desecration. He had gone to her grave. He was not just attacking the rancher. He was attacking the husband, the widower. He was twisting the knife in the oldest, deepest wound. The message was chillingly clear. I know your past. I know your pain. Nothing is sacred, and I'm coming for what you love now. Part 6, Blood and Justice. The withered calla lily was not a threat. It was a death sentence delivered with poetic cruelty. It severed the last thread of Jack's restraint. The waiting was over. The psychological games had ended. And the cold, simple arithmetic of violence was all that remained. He was no longer a man defending his home. He was a man preparing to bury his enemies in its soil. An unnerving calm settled over the Seabar. The work of the ranch continued, but with a deadly focus. Every man cleaned his rifle with meticulous care. Boxes of cartridges were placed strategically by the windows of the main house and the bunkhouse. There was no fear in the men's eyes, only a grim, unwavering loyalty. They were Callahan's men, and they would hold the line. Jack and Evelyn moved through the tense hours in a world of their own. The trivialities of life had been burned away, leaving only the essential. A shared look across the room was a vow. A brief touch of hands was a promise. They spoke little, but every word was freighted with meaning. He showed her how to load his Winchester rifle, his hands over hers, the movement steady and precise. She, in turn, organized bandages and clean water in the kitchen, her practicality a quiet anchor in the rising storm. She was not a warrior, but she would not be a helpless bystander. The attack came on the second night, under the sliver of a dead moon. The darkness was absolute, a thick black velvet that swallowed sound and light. The first sign of trouble was not a gunshot, but the sudden, panicked whinny of horses from the main barn, followed by a soft, sinister orange glow that flickered against the high windows. Fire! The cry came from a sentry on the roof, sharp and urgent. It was a classic tactic, as old as warfare itself, a diversion. Rourke was trying to draw them out, to divide their strength, to force them to choose between saving their livelihood and saving their lives. Ben, take 4 men and try to contain it, Jack yelled, his voice cutting through the rising alarm. Don't try to be heroes, just keep it from spreading to the house, the rest of you, to your posts. They'll come from the east, using the fire for cover. Men scrambled into position, their faces grim in the flickering firelight. Jack stood on the main porch, his Winchester in one hand, his Colt strapped to his hip, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the growing inferno. He could feel them out there, a dozen disciplined killers, using the chaos Rourke had created to tighten their net. As Ben and his small team raced toward the burning barn, Evelyn grabbed Jack's arm. Her face was pale in the hellish light, but her eyes were clear and fiercely intelligent. It's the map, Jack, she said, her voice low and urgent. That's all they really want. Rourke won't risk all his men in a direct assault if he thinks he can get it another way. What are you saying? He asked, his focus still on the darkness. A second diversion, she said, the plan forming in her mind with desperate clarity. They think I'm a helpless woman from the east. They'll expect me to panic, to run. If they saw someone riding out, heading south, away from the fight. He understood immediately. It was a brilliant, deadly gamble. If it worked, it could split Rourke's force, drawing a significant number of them away on a fool's errand. If it failed, the rider would be cut down in the open. "No," he said, his voice flat and final. "Absolutely not." "It's our only real chance," she insisted, her grip tightening on his arm. "Rourke is a professional. He's not expecting this. He's expecting a straightforward fight. We have to be smarter." He looked down at her, at the raw courage in her face, and the conflict tore at him. To let her go, even as a decoy, felt like a betrayal of his promise to protect her. But he knew, with a cold certainty, that she was right. A frontal assault against Rourke's superior numbers was a losing battle. Ben, his face already smudged with soot, ran back from the barn. "It's no good. Boss, they doused the whole front wall with oil. We can't get close. It's going up like a torch." He saw the look on their faces, heard the last of Evelyn's plea. Ben was older than the other hands, a quiet man who had ridden with Jack for 15 years. He was the closest thing Jack had to a friend. "She's right. Jack," Ben said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Let me go. I'll take the gray mare. She's the fastest. I'll stuff a saddlebag to look like she's carrying something important. They'll see an old man running scared. They'll take the bait." Jack looked from Evelyn's determined face to Ben's steady, loyal eyes. It was a choice between two impossibilities. He gave a single, agonized nod. "Stay low. Follow the creek bed as far as you can before you break for open ground. Godspeed, Ben." "I'll need this," Evelyn said, her mind racing. She grabbed a spare lantern and a length of rope, while Ben saddled the mare in the relative darkness behind the house. She worked quickly, tying the unlit lantern to the saddle horn, high enough to be seen. Ben mounted, a lumpy saddlebag clutched in his hand. He looked down at Jack. "Take care of her, boss." It was a final, simple command. "You take care of yourself," Jack growled, his throat tight. Ben nodded, then disappeared into the night. Inside the house, Evelyn joined Jack at a window overlooking the yard. "Now we give them something to see," she whispered. She pulled the precious map from her satchel. It was a fake. She and Jack had spent a long, tense evening 2 nights prior creating it, a meticulous copy of the real map, which was now safely hidden beneath a loose hearthstone. She held the decoy up so it was visible, then made a great show of thrusting it into a leather satchel and handing it to Maria. "Guard this with your life," she said, her voice loud enough to carry. It was all theater, a desperate play for an unseen audience. They could only pray that one of Rourke's men was close enough to have seen the exchange. 10 minutes later, a frantic shout rose from the darkness to the south. "She's getting away! She's on a horse!" It had worked. The cry was followed by the thunder of a half-dozen horses galloping away from the ranch, chasing the ghost that Ben had become. Rourke had split his force. But their relief was short-lived. The remaining attackers, now realizing they had been tricked or that their primary target was escaping, launched their assault on the house. Gunfire erupted from the darkness, the bullets thudding into the thick log walls. The men of the C-Bar returned fire. The ranch house transformed into a roaring bastion of defiance. Jack was a whirlwind of deadly motion. He moved from window to window, his Winchester barking, his shots measured and precise. He fought with a cold, focused rage, the specter of Isabella's death driving him, the fierce need to protect Evelyn sharpening his senses to a razor's edge. One of Rourke's men, emboldened by the covering fire, made a desperate dash for the porch. Jack's rifle was empty. Before the outlaw could take aim, Jack dropped the rifle, his hand a blur as he uncoiled the lasso from his belt. The rope sang through the air, the loop settling perfectly around the man's neck. Jack yanked back with brutal force, pulling the man off his feet and crashing him headfirst into a porch column. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the coppery tang of blood. Evelyn worked tirelessly, reloading rifles, her hands quickly becoming deft and sure, her mind a block of ice against the terror. She was a part of the fight, her intelligence and courage as vital as any bullet. Then, through a lull in the gunfire, they heard it, a single triumphant whoop from the south, followed by a volley of shots, and then a horrifying silence. Jack's face went white. He knew. Ben's diversion had been successful, but it had cost him his life. The grief was a physical blow, so sharp and sudden it stole his breath, but there was no time to mourn. The remaining attackers, realizing their prize was gone, redoubled their assault, a wave of pure, frustrated fury. The loss of Ben ignited something terrible and primal in Jack. He let out a roar that was pure, untamed rage, and launched himself out onto the porch, his Colt peacemaker now in his hand. He was no longer a tactician, no longer a defender. He was an avenger. He became a specter of death in the firelight, his gun spitting flame, his movements fluid and unstoppable. The outlaws, accustomed to fighting scared ranchers, faltered before this elemental force of grief and fury. They had come seeking gold, but they had found a man with nothing left to lose, fighting for the only thing that mattered. Seeing their advantage lost and their leader gone, the remaining attackers broke. They scrambled back into the darkness, their retreat as chaotic as their attack had been disciplined. The sound of their hoofbeats faded into the night, leaving behind an eerie, ringing silence broken only by the crackle of the dying fire from the barn and the ragged breathing of the survivors. The battle was over. They had won. The ranch had held, as the first pale fingers of dawn crept over the horizon. Jack walked out into the yard. The ground was littered with the bodies of Rourke's men. His own men were few, but they were all alive, tending to their wounds. The great barn was a smoldering, skeletal ruin against the soft pink sky. The victory felt hollow, tasting of ash and loss. He walked south, toward the creek bed. He found Ben a half-mile out. He had put up a hell of a fight. 2 of Rourke's men lay dead around him. Ben was propped against a cottonwood tree, his own pistol still clutched in his hand. His eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the sky he had known his whole life. Jack knelt beside his friend, the grief he had held back during the fight washing over him in a silent, devastating wave. He had asked this good, loyal man to ride into the dark for him, and the dark had taken him. This was the price of his love for Evelyn. This was the cost of justice in a land where it was so often bought with blood. Evelyn found him there, a lone figure kneeling in the quiet dawn. She came and knelt beside him, her hand resting on his shaking shoulder. She had no words to offer, no comfort for a wound so deep. She simply knelt with him in silence, sharing the immense weight of the sacrifice that had been made. Their love had survived the fire and the guns, but it was now baptized in the blood of a friend. They had won, but the West had claimed its due. Part 7. Light and Promise. The dawn that followed the battle was cruelly beautiful. The sky was washed in pale, delicate shades of rose and gold, a serene canvas that bore no memory of the previous night's violence. But on the ground, the story was written in blood, ash, and silence. The great barn was a blackened skeleton, its charred timbers reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. The air, thick with the smell of burnt wood and death, was a stark contrast to the clean, crisp morning. They buried Ben near the small patch of cottonwoods where he had fallen, on a gentle rise overlooking the creek. It wasn't the family cemetery where Isabella lay. This spot felt like his. The service was short, the words spoken by Jack choked and spare. The remaining ranch hands stood with their hats in their hands, their sun-cracked faces carved with a grief that was too deep for tears. They were hard men, accustomed to the casual brutality of the West. But Ben's death was different. He hadn't been taken by a wild horse or a winter storm. He had been sacrificed in a war that was not his own. Evelyn stood beside Jack, her hand resting lightly on his arm, offering the silent, steadfast support that was the only comfort possible. She watched him, his face a mask of stone, his eyes fixed on the fresh mound of earth. She saw the guilt and sorrow warring within him, a private torment he believed he had to bear alone. The cost of their victory was a debt he had placed entirely on his own soul. After the burial, a profound weariness settled over the sea bar. The adrenaline of the fight had ebbed away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the hollow ache of loss. The men moved like ghosts, cleaning up the grim aftermath of the battle, their movements slow and heavy. The rhythm of the ranch was broken, its heart wounded. That evening, the sun began its descent, and the sky once again put on a spectacle of breathtaking color. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the violent, blood-red sunset of a world on fire. It was a soft, pure, golden light, a river of liquid gold that flowed across the plains, touching the land with a gentle, healing grace. It was a light that promised peace, that hinted at the possibility of a new beginning. Evelyn found Jack on the porch, where he so often kept his solitary vigils. He was staring out at the golden landscape, a glass of whiskey in his hand. But he wasn't drinking. He was simply holding it, his knuckles white. The ghosts were with him, their presence almost palpable in the quiet air. She came and stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just watched the light transform the world, softening the harsh lines of the land and gilding the charred ruins of the barn in a forgiving glow. "It was my fault," Jack said finally, his voice a low, rough whisper, not meant for her but for the ghosts only he could see. "Ben, he died for me, for my choice. He died for us." "Jack," she corrected softly, "he made his own choice. He was your friend. He did it out of love." The word of love seemed to break something inside him. He finally turned to look at her, and the stone mask had crumbled. His eyes were raw with a pain that was 5 years old, a wound that had been torn open anew. "5 years ago," he began, his voice thick with unshed tears, "I stood right here, on this porch, and watched the smoke rise from a line shack they'd set on fire. It was a diversion, just like last night. I was younger then, more arrogant. I thought this house, these walls, were enough to protect her." He took a ragged breath, the confession spilling out of him, the words he had never spoken to another living soul. "I left her here, with 2 men to guard the house. I took the rest of the hands and rode out to fight the main raiding party, to save the herd. I thought I was protecting my legacy, my empire. By the time I realized it was a feint, it was too late. They had sent only 3 men to the house. 3 men. They killed the guards, and they killed Isabella." He looked away, his gaze fixed on some terrible point in the past. It wasn't a fight. She was just there, an obstacle between them and the safe. "When I got back, all of this," he made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the vast ranch, the thousands of cattle, the empire he had built, all of it was worthless. It was just a pile of dirt and wood that hadn't been strong enough to save her. I failed her. My pride, my focus on the ranch, it killed her as surely as their bullets did. He fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging in the golden air. Evelyn's heart ached for him, for the terrible, lonely burden he had carried for so long. She reached out and took the whiskey glass from his unresisting hand, setting it aside on the railing. Then she took his hand in both of hers, her touch gentle but firm. "You didn't fail her, Jack," she said, her voice filled with a conviction that demanded to be heard. "The evil that men do is not your fault. You built a beautiful world for her. You gave her a home. You loved her. That is never a failure." She looked into his eyes, forcing him to meet her gaze. "My world was the opposite of yours. It was safe, protected, orderly, but it was a cage. I was raised to be a prize, an object to be displayed and eventually sold to the highest bidder. I never knew what it was to be truly loved. or to be seen for who I was. My dream, when I ran away, wasn't just about freedom from Silas Croft. It was about finding this, her eyes softened, a place where I could be a partner, not property, a place where I could build a life that mattered, a home. Her voice dropped to a whisper, sharing her deepest, most secret hope. I used to dream of having a family, of children with eyes the color of a winter sky. I dreamed of a house filled not with polite, empty chatter, but with real laughter, a place where their father would come home at the end of the day, smelling of the sun and the earth, and his presence would make the whole house feel safe. She was describing him. She was describing the life that had been stolen from him, and she was offering it back, not as a replacement, but as a new and different dream they could build together from the ashes of their pasts. A single tear traced a path through the dust on Jack's cheek. He looked at her, at the hope and love shining in her stormy eyes, and he felt a shift deep within his soul. The guilt, the grief, the ghosts, they were still there. But for the first time, they were not the only thing. There was something else now, something warm and alive, a future. As the last sliver of the golden sun disappeared below the horizon, he drew her gently toward him. The light was fading, but it wasn't being replaced by darkness, but by a soft, peaceful twilight filled with the promise of stars. He looked down at her, his expression one of awe and profound tenderness. His hand, which had known only the roughness of reins and the coldness of steel, rose with an uncharacteristic hesitation. He laid it softly, reverently, on her abdomen, his large palm covering her completely. It was an instinct, a primal, hopeful gesture that came from a place deeper than thought. He wasn't just touching her. He was touching their future, a new life, a reason to rebuild the barn, to plant new fields, to believe in the dawn again. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat, and she placed her own hand over his. A silent confirmation passed between them. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, his eyes closing as he breathed in her scent. The vow he had made in the heart of the storm, a promise born of passion and desperation, was now remade in the quiet of the twilight, reforged into something sacred and enduring. "All of me is yours," he whispered. And this time, the words held no ghosts of the past. They were filled only with the light of their shared promise. All of his strength, all of his pain, all of his love, and all of his hope belonged to her, and to the new life they would build together. Part 8. The Unextinguished Flame. The morning after the promise was not a morning of celebration, but one of quiet, resolute purpose. The golden light that had blessed their vow now illuminated the hard work ahead. The ruins of the barn stood as a monument to their loss, a daily reminder of the price they had paid. But where Jack once would have seen only the tomb of his past, he now saw the foundation for his future. The first act of rebuilding was not with hammers and nails, but with spades and silence. Together, Jack, Evelyn, and the remaining hands cleared the last of the debris from the yard and tended to the graves of the fallen. A strange sense of peace settled over them as they worked. The violence had been purged, and in its place was a clean, solemn quiet. That afternoon, the town came to them. It wasn't a mob with questions or a party with congratulations. It was a slow, shame-faced procession, led by the sheriff. He rode up to the ranch house, his hat in his hand, his eyes unable to meet Jack's. He had seen the bodies they'd brought back to town. He had heard the stories from the few ranch hands who had gone in for supplies. The truth, stripped of Cole Rourke's gold-laced lies, was stark and undeniable. "Callahan," the sheriff began, his voice rough with humility. "We, the town, we were wrong. We let fear and greed blind us. What you did here, you fought a battle for all of us." Jack looked past the sheriff at the handful of ranchers and storekeepers who had followed him. He saw in their faces not just shame, but a newfound respect, forged in the crucible of their own cowardice. They were looking at him, and at Evelyn, who stood quietly by his side, as if for the first time. They saw not a scandal, but a symbol of a courage they had failed to muster. "The fight's not over," Jack said, his voice even, without a trace of accusation. "Silas Croft is still out there. His money's no good here anymore." The storekeeper, Mr. Gable, spoke up, his gaze finding Evelyn. "Ma'am, we're sorry for the way you were treated." It was a small thing, an apology offered in the face of so much loss. But it was a beginning. The town of redemption, so long a place of judgment and suspicion, had been given a chance to live up to its name. The next day, a wagon arrived from town, laden with donated lumber and tools, followed by a half-dozen men offering their labor. The rebuilding of the barn became a communal effort, a silent act of penance and solidarity. As they worked, raising the new timber frame against the vast Texas sky, the animosity that had poisoned the air between the ranch and the town began to dissipate, replaced by the shared sweat and purpose of a community healing itself. One evening, weeks later, after a long day of work, Jack and Evelyn sat before the great stone hearth. The new barn was half built, a symbol of progress rising from the ashes. The tension of the siege had faded, replaced by the easy intimacy of two people who had faced the worst together and survived. Evelyn reached into her satchel and pulled out the real map, its oiled canvas worn and soft from its long journey. She looked at the intricate lines, the notations that represented a king's fortune, a legacy of her father's broken dreams. It had been the cause of so much pain, so much bloodshed. "What do we do with it?" she asked quietly. "It's a treasure, but it feels like a curse." Jack looked at the map, then at her face, bathed in the warm firelight. He saw the stormy eyes that had challenged him, the gentle hands that had tended his wounds, the quiet strength that had become the bedrock of his world. He thought of the life stirring within her, a future more precious than all the gold in the Sierra Madre. He reached out and took the map from her hands. He held it for a moment, a look of profound finality on his face. Then, without a word, he tossed it into the heart of the fire. They watched together as the flames licked at the edges of the canvas. The ink of her father's dreams sizzled and vanished. The lines leading to a fortune in gold curled into black ash. The curse was broken. The treasure they had been fighting for was not buried in some distant mountain. It was right here, in this room, in the quiet, steady beating of their two hearts. The seasons turned. Summer arrived, painting the plains in a coat of verdant green and crowning the hills with wildflowers. The new barn was completed, bigger and stronger than the one it had replaced. Its fresh pine scent was a testament to new beginnings. The Seabar Ranch was alive again, its rhythms restored, its heart beating strong. The sounds of laughter were heard more often in the big house, and Maria's smile was a constant presence. The change in Jack was the most profound. The haunted, solitary man was gone. He still carried the scars of his past, the memory of Isabella and the loss of Ben. But they were no longer chains that bound him to his grief. They were a part of the man he had become, a man who understood the fragility of life and the fierce, precious value of love. He worked alongside his men, not as a commander ruling from a distance, but as a brother, sharing their burdens and their triumphs. Evelyn blossomed in the Texas sun. The fear that had lived in her eyes for so long was replaced by a serene, confident light. She was no longer a refugee, but the mistress of the Seabar, her quiet intelligence and gentle grace earning the fierce loyalty of every man on the ranch. She was the heart of their new world, and the gentle swell of her belly was a promise of the future she and Jack were building together. One warm summer night, with a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, they sat by a small campfire a short distance from the house. The air was soft, filled with the scent of sagebrush and the gentle chirping of crickets. The great house stood behind them, its windows glowing with a warm, welcoming light. Jack wrapped his arm around Evelyn. pulling her close against his side. She leaned her head on his shoulder, her hand resting on his over their child. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, watching the embers of the fire dance like captured stars. "I used to think this land was my freedom," Jack said, his voice a low, reflective rumble. "I thought that by owning all of this, by being beholden to no man, that I was free, but I wasn't." He looked down at her, his eyes filled with a love so deep it was a form of worship. "I was a prisoner, trapped in this big house with my memories, just going through the motions of being alive. My world was vast, but it was empty." He tightened his embrace, his cheek resting against the top of her head. "You brought freedom to me. Evelyn, you rode into my life, a storm of trouble and courage. And you didn't just ask for shelter. You demanded that I live again. You made me fight for something more than a memory." He fell silent for a moment, the truth of his next words settling in his soul. He had been her rescuer, her protector, the walls of his ranch, her sanctuary. But she, in turn, had given him something far greater. "Now," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "I will be a home for you." She looked up at him, tears shimmering in her eyes, and saw her past, her present, and all of her tomorrows reflected in his gaze. Here, in the heart of the wild and unforgiving West, a land of dust and blood, they had found their truth, that love and courage are never cheap, but for two people who dare to choose each other against the darkness, they are the greatest treasure of all. The unextinguished flame of their shared spirit would burn brightly now, a beacon of hope for all the years to come. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. To connect and share your thoughts, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night, like the video, and give it an extra boost by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.